Friends, thank you for coming to this Dean's Hour. And of course, we're coming to hear from Change-Charlene Quint, and she has a very contemporary topic to address, given the Me Too issues that are going on in our society at the present time. Change-Charlene is a trained lawyer with her own law firm that specialises in the area of domestic abuse. But she's also involved in other organisations like A Safe Place that works in Lake County, A Safer Lake County, and other sorts of institutions that are addressing this sort of issue in the very county in which we're placed. And Change-Charlene herself is a survivor of domestic abuse, so she's not speaking from a theoretical position alone. She can speak from the inside, as it were, to us. Change-Charlene is a great friend of this institution. For 10 years, Change-Charlene was one of our regents. The Board of Regents, that's our governing body. So she was a governor for some 10 years, up until fairly recently, actually.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
And so, as I say, we have a great friend of Trinity here in Change-Charlene. And so I will hand it over to you.
Thank you.
And away you go.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you. Well, what a privilege to be back here at Trinity. This is a magical place, isn't it? That lives are transformed through ideas and education and friends and professors and friendships and music and sports and, most importantly, our time with God. So it's just great to be back on campus. So in the past few weeks and months, we've seen an avalanche of privileged men fall from grace because of their sexual abuse of women and in the workplace, and most recently in the domestic abuse of women at home. It's finally come to light in such numbers that we can no longer ignore it or sweep it under the rug. When dozens of women share the same story, it can no longer be ignored. But when hundreds of thousands of women share their own personal stories on #MeToo, you have a movement. And what we are seeing today is a sea change in how people are viewing sexual abuse in the workplace and domestic abuse at home. But what do sexual abusers and domestic abusers have in common? Well, it should come as no surprise that abusers are equal opportunity abusers. Those same people who abuse their power in the workplace also abuse their power at home, with women, with children, and even with pets. So I'm going to focus today on domestic abuse and sexual abuse, but the same issues apply in the workplace. Domestic abuse is probably the most misunderstood, covered up, silenced epidemic that is destroying our families and our girls and our women and our boys and men in our communities and our churches. So while many people think of domestic abuse as just something that happens in lower socioeconomic communities, it is just as prevalent in privileged communities, but a whole lot more covered up behind million-dollar homes and powerful careers and BMWs. So I warn you, this is going to be an uncomfortable but eye-opening conversation, and one we, the church, need to have, and one that our country needs to have. This is a church topic that church leaders need to understand, but very few do. So today's goal, my goal, is to show you just the tip of the iceberg, to educate and equip you, the future and current leaders of our church. Today we're going to learn what abuse is, the tactics that abusers use not only on their victims, but on you, the leaders of the church, and the effect of abuse on women, and how the church can lead the way, and must lead the way, in changing the culture and supporting the victim. So you may be wondering why I'm standing here. I'm a former CFO of a major publishing house and a former corporate lawyer, and I'm now talking about abuse. So for me, being an expert on abuse is not just part of my profession that I use as an attorney, now representing women and children, nor is it an academic exercise, although there is a plethora of studies done on it. But for me, this is also a personal story. My story is typical of domestic and sexual abuse in an affluent area where domestic abuse is covered up by the abuser and the victim and the family and the employer and the church. I lived in Lake Forest, right next door, where the average home is over $1 million. And I was known as Mrs. Tom Kalabik for over 21 years while I was married to an abuser. Professionally, I worked as a corporate attorney for Schiff Harden, a large, prestigious Chicago law firm, which actually represented this institution. I was active in the community, in my children's schools, and a deacon and leader at Christ Church in Lake Forest. As Dean Cole said, I served for 10 years on the Board of Regents, and I taught as an adjunct professor here. My husband was the life of the party, a professional, successful businessman, and he even attended church. But he was also a textbook example of a narcissistic sociopath, which are the vast majority of abusers. So I was the last person you would think was living with domestic abuse, but behind closed doors, my life was very different. So in addition to discussing domestic and sexual abuse in the larger context, I'll be sharing a little bit of my personal story with you. So let's start with Scripture. In Paul's letter to his young protege, he warned in 2 Timothy 3, "You should know this, Timothy, that in the last days there will be very difficult times, for people will love only themselves and their money. They will be boastful and proud, scoffing at God, disobedient to their parents, and ungrateful. They will consider nothing sacred. They will be unloving and unforgiving. They will slander others, and they will have no self-control. They will be cruel and hate what is good. They will betray their friends and be reckless and be puffed up with pride and love pleasure rather than God. They will act religious, but they will reject the power that can make them godly." So we have a name for these people that Paul is describing. They're called abusers. Specifically, these are the church-going abusers who sit in our pews and, like the Pharisees, put on a good show, but behind closed doors are very cruel. And Paul gives us all very good advice. Have nothing to do with them. So, who are these abusers? Let's get a show of hands. How many have seen that video clip of NFL player Ray Rice knock out his fiancée in the elevator? All right, so too often we think that this is the typical abuser. We think it's a minority issue or something, an issue for someone from the hood or an NFL player issue. We don't think it's a middle class or upper class issue, and we certainly don't think it's an issue in our churches. But domestic abuse happens everywhere, as we've seen revealed in the last few months. My apologies to the good men in this audience, but I will be using the personal pronoun he when I discuss abusers because over 85% of abusers are male. Abusers have a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality. In the affluent areas, they are men with privilege and powerful jobs. They're doctors and lawyers and businessmen and accountants and professionals and even pastors who are charming, church-going Dr. Jekyll by day, but behind the closed doors, they are evil Mr. Hyde. Abusers consist of those with what psychologists called cluster B personality disorders, of narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, from which we get sociopaths and psychopaths. These are dangerous, permanent, untreatable, incurable mental illnesses. They are characterized by a complete lack of conscience, a lack of empathy, a lack of remorse, pathological lying, arrogance, entitlement, a flagrant violation of the rights of others, and using others as for their own selfish needs. They're incapable of real love, but they use the word love to trap others into a relationship. They have an insatiable desire for power and control, especially over their wife or intimate partner. And so abuse is a comprehensive set of behaviors and attitudes designed to gain and maintain power and control. Now, how many of these people are out there? Narcissists make up 6% of the population, and sociopaths and psychopaths make up about 4% of the population. Now, some people have both disorders, but roughly it's about 10% of the population that looks completely normal on the outside, walking around in a suit with a powerful job, sitting in the pews, but has a dangerous disorder, who will ruin the life of anyone in a relationship with them. So what's the prevalence of abuse? According to a recent survey by the Center for Disease Control, 35% of women will endure rape, physical abuse, or stalking in her lifetime. 20% of women will be raped in her lifetime. 1 in 4 men will actually endure abuse in his lifetime. 50% of children who come from an abusive home will themselves grow up to be abusers. And a majority of the other half of the children will grow up and marry abusers, be their partners. And sadly, these statistics are no different for Christians. If domestic abuse was a disease, it would be an epidemic. Just to put this in perspective, the percentage of women who will be raped, physically assaulted, or stalked in their lifetime is approximately equal to the percentage of the population who will get all forms of cancer combined. So, let's talk about the tactics that abusers use. There are essentially 5 types of abuse, and most abusers use all types. As I said, they're equal opportunities. So the first and most common is verbal and emotional abuse, which is prevalent in 100% of abusive relationships. This is where it starts. So the scars are unseen but debilitating for the victim. Emotional abuse includes, but is certainly not limited to, bullying and name-calling and raging and lying and gaslighting. And if you haven't heard that term, it's when they're doing or saying something that is very harmful and then deny that they've done it or said it to the victim so that she questions her very sanity. Projection, which is accusing someone else of the very thing that he's most guilty of. Silent treatment, insults, manipulation, telling your children their mother is worthless, throwing away treasured items, either threatening divorce or to kill her or to set fire to the house or stalking. The list goes on and on. There's really no conflict resolution with an abuser. Their only goal is to win and for you to lose. They always have to be right, which means that everyone else is blamed, especially the spouse, when things go sideways, and they refuse to take responsibility for their own actions. So in my case, my husband used all of the above techniques. Within 2 weeks of the wedding, my husband threatened to divorce me multiple times a week, literally hundreds of times for the first year, and his criticism was constant. Within the first year, I left with my 5-year-old son, and my husband begged me to come back. But although I was reluctant to return, like the flip of a switch, he acted nice again, like we were dating. So I didn't realize at that time that false apologies and a temporary change of behavior and begging a victim to return is part of the cycle of abuse that keeps women in abusive marriages. So when his good behavior came through, I thought this horrible past was behind us, and I agreed to have children. But after the children came, the abuse returned. I didn't know at the time that abusers use children to keep their wives in abusive relationships. The last thing a woman wants to do is break up her family, especially with young children, and abusers know that. So once a woman has a child with an abuser, he knows he can do nearly anything to her, and she will stay for the children. So I call these children anchor babies. So at any time I made a respectful and reasonable request to simply be nice, he just raged and screamed, "I am nice." But if I cried because of intentional cruelty, he raged. And if I had righteous anger, he raged even louder. I didn't realize that there was just no confronting an abuser with bad behavior. They only want to win, and they want to win at all costs. As he told me, I don't care about you, I don't care about what you think, and I don't care about what you feel. And that's the essence of abuse. So as an equal opportunity abuser, he was also abusive to anybody that he felt was beneath him, which is really anyone that didn't have power and money. He had risen to the position of a chief operating officer, and he made over $1 million a year, but he was so abusive to employees that he was fired in 2000, but he told everybody else that he had retired. He was abusive to service people and waiters and waitresses and hotel workers, throwing tantrums and insulting them when things weren't to his liking. We had a steady stream of nannies, most of them from Trinity, some staying only weeks, citing his verbal abuse for their leaving. One young lady left me a note, and she said she decided to leave after he had forced her to clean the floor grout in a 20 by 20 room on her knees with a toothbrush. I obviously, when I left, called all my nannies, which I keep in touch with, and apologized profusely because I did not understand the depth to which he had stooped. But the second most prevalent thing is financial abuse, which is prevalent in literally 98% of these relationships. Financial abuse includes not allowing his wife to have any access to funds, not putting his wife's name on any bank accounts, making his wife ask for money every time she needs it, demanding receipts for every penny she spends, keeping financial secrets, wasting large amounts of money without asking for her approval, sabotaging her career, making her quit her own career, refusing to support his wife and his children even though they're capable of doing so. For me and for other women married to wealthy businessmen with staffs of accountants and lawyers at their disposal, financial abuse takes on twists and turns and deceptions and lies found only in Sherlock Holmes movies. So financial abuse started even before the wedding. After we became engaged, he asked me to quit my position as a publishing executive, as a CFO, purportedly so that I could travel with him and stay at home with the children that we had hoped to have. But as with all abusers, when they propose a favor to you, they are in fact deceiving and manipulating you into something that is in their best interest, very much to your detriment. So after I had resigned as a CFO and hired my replacement the day before the wedding, on my birthday, he told me I had to sign a 28-page prenuptial agreement or he would never see me again. The prenuptial agreement, which he had been working for months with his attorneys, was a pre-planned divorce. It stated that throughout the marriage, all his income and everything he ever made was his, and everything he ever bought with everything he ever made was his, and that every asset was his. It further stated that he was entitled to do anything he wanted, financially or otherwise, without consulting me. And if a divorce was filed, I had to move out of the house within a certain number of days, and I was supposed to be paid a certain amount for every year that I was married. So this was essentially an employment agreement. I was devastated, but I didn't want to start a marriage like that, but I had a 5-year-old from a previous abusive relationship from my college sweetheart, and since I did quit my job, and now I had no way to support him. So I signed the agreement, and I just hoped for the best, just as he had planned. So for the entire 21 years, I never had access to what a healthy marriage would call marital funds. We had no joint accounts. We had no joint assets whatsoever. Everything was entitled in his name. So I decided to go to law school to support my family and make my own nest egg. I took out nearly $100,000 in student loans, and once again, he offered me a favor. He would pay off my student loan, but I had to pay him back. So he took money out of my little monthly allowance every month. When I had finally repaid my $100,000 of student loans to him, he claimed he had no recollection of that agreement, and he continued to take money out of my monthly allowance for the remainder of the marriage. So even though he had a net worth of $22 million, after paying for child care, my monthly allowance was exactly zero for all 6 of us. So I spent my entire paycheck supporting our family while he added to his net worth. And at the end of the 21-year marriage, I had a nest egg of exactly zero, which is precisely what he had planned. So, like a Sherlock Holmes movie, true characters and motives become clear after one discovers the pieces of the puzzle that have been cleverly hidden. What I discovered while digging through some files in the basement and checking out county real estate records and speaking to the former wife was he had been scheming and lying for over 40 years. He had lied under oath to his previous wife about some real estate that he had owned but hidden in a trust. And he lied to me when he claimed that he had filed for divorce from his first wife, when in fact she filed for divorce from him for many of the same reasons that I did. I also discovered that his financial statements presented to me back in 1992, along with his prenuptial agreement, were falsely inflated by millions of dollars, and his financial statements presented to me in 2012 during the divorce were falsely deflated by millions of dollars, so that the ending net worth and the beginning balance was exactly the same. So, of course, he argued during the divorce that his own prenuptial agreement was unenforceable and that he had accumulated zero assets during the 21-year marriage where he was making over $1 million a year, and under divorce law, I should have half of zero. So, the third type of abuse is physical abuse, which is a prevalent in a majority of abusive relationships. So classic forms of physical abuse are hitting and weapons and burns and shoving down the stairs and other unwanted physical contact. But many affluent abusers are way too smart to leave bruises on their wives, so they use other forms, like withholding medical treatment or medications and refusing to take their wife to the emergency room for illnesses or giving birth, or pushing them out of the car miles away, shoving or grabbing them, spitting on them. In my case, one of the ways my husband would show he was in real control was by refusing to take me to the emergency room. And instead, he would go on his shopping errands for hours with me in the back seat, writhing in pain, whether it was for the birth of our 2 children or whether it was for my bouts of diverticulitis, which I had developed because of living with constant stress. So after he dropped me off at the ER, finally, he continued with his errands, and I spent several days in the hospital each time. But one of the most traumatizing events came in December of 2002 when our children were 4 and 7. My law firm, Schiff Harden, hosted a holiday party, and my managing partner asked me to drive an intoxicated guest home who lived in Chicago. So I drove our overserved guest home in his car as my husband followed behind me, and I dropped him off about 2 a.m. But when I got in my husband's car, he exploded in a rage I had never seen before, and that was escalating by the second. I was terrified, and he was out of control. So at the next stoplight, I hopped out of the car, hoping that he would just calm down, come to his senses, and ask me to get back in the car. But he didn't. He sped away, and I was left 35 miles from home in Chicago in a gang-infested neighborhood with no coat, no cell phone, no money, no credit cards, in the snow, with only an evening gown on. The fourth type of abuse that we look at is sexual abuse, which goes hand in hand with abusers because abusers with these dangerous disorders use people as objects. So sexual abuse in a marriage includes pornography addiction and rape and affairs and orgies and forcing the wife to perform any degrading and dehumanizing acts you could possibly imagine that are in a porn movie. Sexual abuse is perhaps the most devastating of all abuse because it takes an act that was designed by God to be life-giving and loving and a tender expression of love between 2 committed people, and it turns it into a humiliating act of cruelty and power over another person. So victims of sexual abuse take years, if not a lifetime, to heal. And it is no mistake that in the Bible, God singles out sexual immorality as something that is uniquely damaging to us. So in my case, I found out because of his own bragging that my husband had carried on multiple affairs over a dozen years in his first marriage. In my marriage, his pornography addiction started quite early, and I was forced to perform degrading and dehumanizing acts. But with the advent of the digital camera in the early 2000s, and you didn't have to go to Walgreens anymore, he began filming and photographing the abuse, which only increased my humiliation, which of course he reveled in. He regularly demanded sex when it was inconvenient or emotionally difficult for me, like right before I had to leave for work, or right after the dog died, right after we had a traumatic house fire that destroyed our house. So when I objected to being treated like a prostitute, I was hounded and grabbed and followed relentlessly until I acquiesced. If I still objected, he flew into a rage and told me he was entitled to sex with me or anyone else. And he yelled, I quote, "I can have sex with anyone I want, anywhere I want, anytime I want." And that's precisely what he did. So by 2012, his abuse had escalated to a frequency and to levels that were just unsustainable for me. I kept hoping God would answer my prayers and soften his heart, but the abuse escalated and I was desperate. So I sent him a lengthy but respectful letter highlighting his actions over the marriage, explaining that his actions fell far short of the love that a husband should show his wife as set forth in the Bible, and I asked him to get counseling. His response, "It's not that bad. If it was that bad, you would have left 10 years ago." So instead of going for counseling, he went to his doctor and got a prescription for Viagra. And from that day, in January of 2012, until the day I left in April of that year, he raped me every morning after the kids went to school and every night as soon as dinner was over. And he stalked me wherever I went through my papers and my emails and my phone, at my law office and at home. But the breaking point came when we went on a spring break to Italy with our children, and throughout Italy, he raped me in front of my teenage children who were in the hotel room bed next to us while we were all begging him to stop. Now, having sex in front of children constitutes a felony, but I cannot prosecute him because Italy is outside the jurisdiction. So when we got home, after 3 days I escaped with only an overnight bag. I went into hiding for 2 years, and not a soul knew my address. The last type of abuse that abusers use is spiritual abuse. Twisting the scriptures and claiming the Bible allows the abuse, and claiming the wife must submit to anything the husband does, and then claiming she must forgive and forget and stay in the marriage because God hates divorce. Wrap it up in the bow. The wife, trying hard to be a good Christian, will just keep praying that her husband will change. And women of faith, Christian women, stay in abusive relationships far longer than others because their religious convictions are so important to them. I counsel women who have stayed in these relationships 20, 30, and even 40 years. And as I said, sometimes it's the pastor, because people who love power are drawn to positions of leadership, regardless of where they are. So I get asked all the time, so why did she marry this guy in the first place? So abusers are predators. They target women, and they will not take no for an answer. Research tells us that they target women who are extremely kind-hearted and loving and giving and forgiving and generous and altruistic and patient and optimistic and see the good in others and intelligent and attractive. And these, of course, are the characteristics of Christian women. These women are not expecting to run into a sociopath because they take Philippians 4:8 to heart. They are looking for the good in others. They're always looking for the lovely and the praiseworthy in others. But what they do lack, and what most Christians lack, and many, many pastors lack, is discerning evil when it masquerades as good. So abusers engage in what professionals call the cycle of violence. There are basically 3 phases to a romantic relationship with an abuser. And of course, to get a woman under his spell, he can't start with being abusive. So every relationship, a romantic relationship, starts with what's called the love bombing phase. The abuser wines and dines his target and compliments her and tells her he's his soulmate and moves quickly to get her emotionally and financially and even sexually dependent on him. And so she falls in love with someone who doesn't even exist. It is a false persona that he has created. The second phase is called the devaluation phase. The abuse starts almost immediately after an abuser has successfully gotten his target emotionally and financially and emotionally dependent on him. This is almost right after a major event, like a wedding. Most married women can tell you the day the abuse started, and it's usually on their wedding day or the day after. They are so shocked that this monster has emerged that they really don't know what to do with us. And the final phase of a romantic relationship is called the discard phase. After a woman leaves a relationship, she usually does so with so much grief and sadness. But on the other hand, the abuser discards his wife with as much emotion as he would discard a kitchen appliance that no longer is useful. He immediately starts up with a new relationship, and the cycle starts all over again. So, what can a woman expect if she stays? Well, abuse thrives in silence, and abuse always escalates if there are no consequences by someone with more power than the abuser. So, if there's power from an employer, or power from the courts, or power from the police, or power from the church, and you impose consequences, it can change. But if there's no consequences, it doesn't change. As the abuser crosses each boundary and finds out that he is still in power, he is emboldened to cross yet another boundary and another. And Harvey Weinstein and Bill O'Reilly and Matt Lauer and Rob Porter were sexual predators for decades. That's why abusers work so hard at silencing and discrediting the people who expose them. And even if she doesn't suffer from broken bones, nearly every woman in an abusive relationship suffers post-traumatic stress disorder from years of trauma. The longer she stays, the more abuse escalates and the less functional she becomes. Domestic abuse costs our country $8.3 billion a year in higher medical costs and lost productivity. So another question I get asked all the time, why does she stay in this abusive relationship? Why didn't she just leave a long time ago? Well, actually, the average woman leaves her abuser 7 times before she finally leaves for good. And there's a number of reasons why she stays. Here's my top 10. 1, her husband was not always this way, and she keeps hoping that the person she fell in love with when she was dating will come back and reappear. 2, when she has tried to leave, he apologizes and begs her to come back and promises to be better, this whole cycle of abuse, and so she wants to believe him. 3, she may be a strong Christian and divorce is strongly discouraged. 4, in 98% of abuse cases, there's financial abuse and she has no access to funds. 5, most women with children do not want to break up a family. 6, most women are in denial. No one wants to believe it's really abuse, and the abuser has told her for years that this is normal. 7, the abuser has threatened, if she leaves, to kill her or cut her off from her family and friends, or to leave her penniless and homeless. And abusers will actually do that, so it's not an idle threat. 8, a marriage relationship is unlike any other. It's one's entire financial and social and emotional and spiritual well-being is tied up with your spouse. And so leaving a spouse, especially an abusive spouse, means a huge loss on many levels, and it's not a decision to be taken lightly. 9, women are trauma bonded to their abuser. When a woman is physically intimate, her body produces a hormone called oxytocin, which forms a strong bond to the person she's intimate with, even if he is toxic. Oxytocin was designed by God to superglue married couples together to withstand the ups and downs of marriage. But in an abusive relationship, Satan uses that same hormone to emotionally superglue a woman to her abuser. And 10, when a woman finally leaves, it's usually because the abuse has escalated and is now directed towards the children. The mama bear comes out, and she takes action to protect them and leaves. So, what can a woman in her church expect when she leaves? Well, even if she leaves, it is 9 times more likely that a woman will be killed when she leaves than when she stays. In far too many cases, this is the case. Right here in Lake Forest, next door, last month, a man shot and killed his former girlfriend, a dentist, and then committed suicide. 3 days later in Highland Park, a man stabbed and tried to kill his girlfriend. The November Texas church massacre, the shooter was a domestic abuser who killed more than half his mother-in-law's church. So thankfully, homicide happens in a minority of cases, but of course it's a real concern. But there are 7 things that a wife and you as church leaders can expect in 100% of the cases when a woman finally leaves. First, the abuser will play the victim. Emotionally mature people take responsibility for their bad behavior and the consequences that come from it. But abusers play the pity card. Oh, poor me. My wife left me, and I never did anything wrong. That's his mantra. Second, the abuser will become vindictive. While you, the pastors and the church leaders, are not looking, he will spend the rest of his life trying to destroy his leaving spouse financially and emotionally and socially and spiritually and physically, all the while smiling and glad handling in your church. 3, the abuser will immediately lie and start a smear campaign at your church and with her family and friends, falsely accusing his wife from everything from adultery to being insane, to lying about the abuse, to kidnapping if she takes the children with her, to abandonment if she doesn't. Psychologists call this social isolation, and it is designed to destroy her support network. Abusers know that one of the best ways to hurt a Christian woman is by turning her church and her family and her friends against her. He wants to win, and if church leaders do not support the victim, he will lay claim to your church as his territory and force the victim out. 4th, just like he does to her support network, the abuser will lie to his children and falsely accuse their mom of affairs, being insane, stealing their college money, being the reason why they don't have any money, being worthless, and all sorts of things. This technique is called parental alienation. And he knows that nothing will hurt a mother like turning her children against her. He wants to win, and he uses the kids as pawns in his game. 5, the abuser will hide assets and lie about his financial condition, whether he's a multimillionaire or a pauper. He will claim he has no income, he will claim he has no assets to keep it from his former spouse and wife. Sixth, the abuser will abuse the legal system and lie to exhaust her financially and emotionally and get custody of the children. And seven, abusers who are church attenders will hang out in a church in an effort to cloak themselves with respectability. For abusers, it's all about the image. They will suddenly be regular attenders and volunteers at your church in an effort to look good to the pastors and the congregants and their kids and, of course, to the next woman. So the abuser, as I said, will claim your church as their territory. So, church, what can we do to change the culture from abuse to respect? Well, first, let's all agree on something that is pretty basic, that there is good and there is evil in this world, and that abuse is a real issue in the church, abuse of evil, and that we need to be on God's side of this issue. I think that the church has forgotten that we are in an epic spiritual battle and that Satan is alive and well, and his mission statement is to steal, kill, and destroy, and he has a lot of minions, including some who sit in our pews. As Christians, we find it hard to call evil what it is, especially when it has a human face on it. We like to think we are the hands and feet of Jesus, right? But we don't like to think that someone else may be the hands and feet of Satan. If Christians really thought we were in a battle with Satan, we would suit up and put our armor on and go to war to protect those who we love and our church and our neighbors. But it's just a whole lot easier not to go there, isn't it? In Bible times, just as now, fathers and husbands protected and supported their wives and their children. And that's why the Bible, it tells us that we must support and defend the fatherless and the widows, because God does. But how much more should we support and defend those whose fathers and husbands are intentionally and ruthlessly abusing them? Second thing we can do, church, is doing what we're doing now. Let's talk about it. Let's preach sermons on it. Let's educate ourselves about abuse and how to support the victim and how to hold abusers accountable. Abuse breeds in silence and secrecy, so we should never be afraid to tell the truth and speak the truth. A recent Lifeway survey found that 64% of pastors never or rarely preach on domestic abuse. In all my years, I have never heard even one sermon on abuse. And even if they haven't told us, we all know someone who's been affected by abuse. Or perhaps you are someone who's been affected by abuse, and you need to start the healing. The church must recognize that it has a congregation full of the walking wounded who need our love and compassion, not our judgment. Third, we can stop blaming the victim. When a woman comes forward to a pastor with the truth of the abuse, she has been traumatized for years. So critics will automatically attack the victim and claim she's lying, and then claim if the abuse was real, she should have pressed charges. The reality is that 90% of rapes don't even get reported. Marital rape happens almost in every abusive marriage, but is almost never reported. Most abuse takes place behind doors, where there's no evidence, there's no videos, there's no photos, there's no documentation. But the first thing a rapist or abuser does is deny or say it was consensual. So even if rape is reported, prosecutors can't prosecute because they don't have the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Employers want to shove it under the rug. Parents don't want to force their children to testify against the other parent. And police and prosecutors and judges also refuse to take action when there's a gap between the abuse and when it's reported. So the normal Christian woman who extends grace and forgiveness, who tries to first get her spouse to go counseling before taking legal action to protect herself and blow up her marriage, is again blamed for not coming forth sooner. So the vast majority of abusers and rapists go unpunished, and many continue to walk around in our churches. Fourth, churches need to be on the leading edge of this and be an example to the rest of the country. So let's get nitty-gritty here. How does a church support a victim of domestic abuse when she comes to her pastor for help? And what are the top 10 common mistakes that pastors make? So here's my top 10 things of how churches can use. First of all, Believe her and validate her. It has taken a lot of courage to reach out to a clergy. She has likely been hiding this abuse for years. Simply being believed and validated is a huge part of the healing. And assure her that regardless of what her abuser has told her, the scriptures do not condone or approve of abuse, ever. So the most common mistakes here are simply pastors not believing her or not validating her, asking why she didn't leave before if it was so bad. This is what she hears. You're a liar. I don't believe you. It devastates a Christian woman who has been trying for years to follow the Lord and honor her marriage to hear this. Another common mistake is telling her that she must submit to her husband and do whatever he does or says, and that if she would just be more submissive, this wouldn't happen. She is already feeling horribly guilty, and this puts her back into that abusive relationship. Let me tell you, he won't change if she's more submissive. Abuse will only escalate. Second, affirm her in her efforts to be a faithful wife and keep her family intact all these years. Affirm her that she is not the problem, that she is not crazy, that the abuser has a problem and will likely never change. Here's the common mistake. Many clergy are unaware that abusers are people with permanent, untreatable, incurable personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorder, sociopathy, and psychopathy. Clergy make the mistake of treating abusers as if they are emotionally healthy, fully functioning individuals by making appeals to their good nature or their conscience or their empathy to change the abuser's actions to be better. But this appeal is fruitless. Abusers are characterized by a lack of conscience and a lack of empathy. And unlike healthy individuals who feel good when they help others, don't you feel good when you help others? But these disordered individuals get an emotional buzz from hurting others and being vindictive. Abusers feel especially pleased with themselves when they can get away with covertly hurting their victims while simultaneously looking good in front of others and their pastors. That's a real plus. So the third thing we can do is make sure she and her children have a safe place to live. Help her find temporary housing if she needs it, either through a congregational ministry if you have one, or refer her to a safe place or your local domestic abuse agency. Common mistake here is most clergy are not experts in domestic abuse. They don't recognize the far-reaching tactics that abusers use or the devastating effects on the victim. They don't understand that housing is a huge need. So many of these victims are so confused themselves, they don't even recognize abuse because they've been taught that it's normal. So clergy need to recognize abuse and make sure they're safe. Many clergy are not familiar with resources of the local domestic violence agencies and therefore don't refer women to them. I have a whole plethora of stuff from A Safe Place, and lines here. So if you need it, please help yourself to some here. So if children are involved, number 4, as mandatory reporters, clergy have a duty to report abuse to DCFS. Reporting is required where the children themselves are being abused or whether they're watching the abuse. So sit with her while she makes the calls to DCFS. And if she won't call, let her know that you are a mandatory reporter and you must call yourself. And the common mistake here is many clergy either don't realize that they're mandatory reporters or they just don't know what child abuse looks like and they don't call. 5, advise her that she should immediately get an order of protection for herself and for her kids at the local court. Here in Lake County, D100 is located right here in Lake County Courthouse and is staffed by people with A Safe Place. They will help her fill out the petition that will protect her and her children and the pets. It's a common mistake here. Clergy just don't know that there's orders of protection available, and they don't advise her to get one. Without an order of protection, the abuse will continue. So if an incident is happening at home, advise her to get and call the police immediately and get out. The common mistake here is many clergy are unable to identify criminal behavior or abusive behavior, and they don't ensure the safety of their congregants, and they don't advise her to do that. Number 7, encourage her and her children to get counseling from professionals who are trained in domestic and sexual abuse. Here in Lake County, that's A Safe Place and Zechariah Center. Common mistake here. Many clergy attempt to engage in marital counseling with the couples, hoping for reconciliation, and the pastors themselves are played by the abuser. Many clergy are unaware that sociopaths and psychopaths and narcissists are very different from the normal marital issues of relatively healthy individuals, like different communication styles or financial worries or teenager issues or elderly parents. Universally, mental health professionals agree that marital counseling is not recommended for people in abusive relationships. Abusers use counseling to play games with the victim and the clergy. Many clergy are fooled by the abuser's false apologies and promises to be better and lies, which are made to get their victim back into the abusive marriage and to look good in front of the church leaders. And when victims don't get counseling from professionals who are trained in these things, they don't heal. And in fact, they get bad advice that is even more damaging. And sadly, even when abusers attend perpetrator counseling, which is often court-ordered, they rarely change. The recidivism rate is nearly 100%. 8, only if she wants and only if it's safe, approach the abuser with 2 other church leaders. Again, I said we're getting nitty-gritty. So a period of separation is needed from the victim and from your congregation. So before allowing him back into your congregation, require him to undertake a few steps that will show that he is truly repentant and not just crying crocodile tears. So true biblical repentance requires a few things. 1, he needs to openly confess his actions to him, to his wife, to his children, and to others. And I say to children and to others because by the time you, the pastor, gets involved, abusers will already have slandered his wife to others. And they need to hear the confession of abuse and the lies that he has already told them. 2, he needs to regularly attend abuser counseling session for at least 6 months, and a safe place offers that. 3, he needs to pay restitution for her losses, her medical bills, her broken personal items, or hotel bills if she's had to get out of the house. And she needs access to marital funds. 4, he needs to change his attitude from one of pride and entitlement to one of humility, and he needs to change his behavior to non-abusive and non-slanderous behavior for at least 6 months. Common mistake here, many clergy are just unwilling to impose church discipline, and they don't understand that abuse doesn't stop without consequences. And they don't realize that abusers who are unwilling to take these steps are not truly repentant. They are naively swayed by abusers who apologize in crocodile tears, but don't want to undergo these steps. So these abusers just want things to go back to how they always were. 9, if the abuser refuses to go through the steps that we just mentioned, the elders should remove him from the membership and prohibit from attending the church until he does. These are steps outlined in Matthew 18, 1 Corinthians 5, 2 Timothy 3, Titus 3. The Bible's plan is brilliant, and it works. What happens when the church has the courage to act as a moral authority and impose church discipline? This is what happens. 1, it allows the victims and her children to safely attend her congregation and be surrounded by supportive church members and not be in fear of running into her abuser at the house of worship. So 2, it helps her healing. 3, it sends a clear message to the children and the congregation and the abuser that his actions are wrong and not condoned. 4, the children and the congregation don't turn against the mother, who the abuser will slander and blame for breaking up the marriage. 5, it prohibits the abuser from returning to congregation and spreading slander and divisiveness in your church. And 6, it is extremely rare that any abuser will go through these steps and change his ways. But it is only through these biblical consequences that he has any chance of humbling himself and turning to God. Jesus and Paul recognized with this when they directed churches to invoke this church discipline. Common mistake here, clergy don't impose church discipline. When clergy and congregational leaders don't impose church discipline, evil wins. It's like refusing to take a side between a match between a tiger and a bunny. The tiger wins. Abuse only changes if there's consequences. And when clergy and congregational leaders do nothing and the abuser has no consequences, the following inevitably results. The abuser is emboldened that he has fooled not only others but the church leaders. And so the abuser, as I said, in every case, will do all the things that we have discussed that I said would happen in 100% of those cases. He will lie, he'll play the pity card, he'll pretend to be the victim, he'll use courts to further the abuse, he'll play the clergy like a fiddle, he'll show up in church and look good and engage in a smear campaign and further try to destroy his wife. And this is what happens when they do that, and churches don't take any action. Because no one wants to believe that their charming friend and their family member and their fellow congregant that sits next to them in pew is actually a pathological liar, and the victim usually takes the high ground because she doesn't share about the abuse. Many will believe the abuser and turn against the innocent victim. It will divide your church and leave the victim feeling further betrayed by her church. She will leave your church because it's no longer safe for her, and she has been betrayed. And in many cases, she will never again set foot in another church, and she will abandon God. You, on the other hand, you get the abuser in your church, who has stalked out your church as his territory and his supporters, just as he planned. The next thing will happen, the children will believe the abuser and turn against the mother, because one, the children don't want to be discarded like they've seen their mother. Two, the children know who has the power and the money, and for survival purposes, they will align with the power and the money. Three, children really don't want to believe that their dad is a liar and a monster. And four, the church hasn't taken a stand on the side of right. This is emotionally devastating for women, and too many times actually leads to suicide. One of the sisters-in-laws of one of the women I counsel actually committed suicide with 3 little ones because it was just too much for her. So if the victim exposes the truth of the abuse, the abuser's supporters will shun her and silence her, and they will call her unchristian and unkind, and it's nice to say these negative things, and she just needs to forgive and forget and move on. And in the meantime, she needs years of healing. And as for the abuser, his prideful heart will never be humbled, because that's what it takes to repent and turn to God. And he will continue in his hardened heart against God and against his spouse. Finally, you need to support a victim if she chooses to divorce her abuser. A marriage to an abuser is not a marriage entered into with fraud and deceit. None of God's purposes for marriage can be met with an abuser. God's people are not designed to be partners with Satan's people. And a divorce at this point is merely a civil legality that recognizes the marriage covenant has already been broken. And I realizing I am stepping into some controversial territory here with the church. That discussion is something I'd love to take up with later on. But let me just note what John Calvin said. God did not lay down a law about divorces so as to give them the seal of his approbation, but as the wickedness of men could not be restrained in any other way, he applied what was the most admissible remedy. Many of God's laws are concessions to contain the effects of sin. And we should be grateful that in his grace, the Lord seeks to mitigate the power of evil. I'm out of time, but I do want to thank you for having me here. I do want to tell you that God's grace is amazing. I don't want to leave you hanging, so I'm going to finish up real quick. I went into hiding for 2 years, but I'm speaking to you today because I serve a God of miracles, and we serve a God of miracles, and he's a God of redemption, and he redeems us from our brokenness and messes. And he's a God, when a situation seems impossible, he parts the Red Sea, and he rescues his people, and he takes them out of bondage, and he gives them a place of rest. And he takes what other people meant for evil, and he uses it for good, and I'm here to tell you that he does that. He's a God of shalom. And when I got healed well enough, he gave me a new assignment, one that I did not want. I'd rather come back here, be with Trinity. He says, no, you have a law degree, and I gave you that. And you have resources, and I gave you that. And you have this experience, and I gave you that. Now you go out and help other women. And like Moses, you bring them out of bondage. We had a little discussion, because that's not what I wanted to do. But he says, I will make you a warrior. I know that's not your personality. I just want everyone to get along. He says, I will make you a warrior. And that's what I do every day. I represent women. And for me, it's the most wonderful thing in the world to see them heal. And I get to be part of it. It's a good day for me when I get out of Lake County Courthouse and I don't have a sheriff escorting me out, because that's how crazy they are on the other side. But the Lord is good. Thank you for having me.
Charlene, thank you for your courage, your transparency, and giving us a message that the church and our society really needs to hear.
Yep. I will be around if you want to have questions. Here's my contact information. I promise to respond to emails or phone calls. There's not a day that goes by that I usually don't talk to somebody. So please feel free to contact me, and I'll be sticking around here if you have any questions to ask me. Thank you.
Good. Thanks again.